I've seen some things in my time. Things that'd make your skin crawl and your blood run cold, but nothing quite compares to the stories I've heard about the giant spiders. Now, I know what you're thinking. Giant spiders. Sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi flick. But let me tell you, when you've been in the military as long as I have, you learn that truth is often stranger than fiction. I served in various conflicts, but it was my time in Southeast Asia that first got me thinking about these eight-legged monsters. Sure, the spiders I encountered weren't the size of dogs or dinner plates, but they were big enough to make a grown man pause. I remember one night on patrol, the humid air clinging to my skin like a second layer of fatigues, when I saw a spider the size of my hand scuttle across our path. For a moment, just a split second, I thought about the stories I'd heard from older vets. Stories about spiders big enough to carry off small animals. I shook it off then, but those tales stuck with me. It wasn't until years later, when I started collecting these accounts, that I realized how far back they went. Take Remy Jansen, for instance, a Belgian officer in the Congo Free State back in the 1890s. Jansen and his patrol were pushing through the dense jungle, the kind of place where the canopy's so thick you can barely tell day from night. They were on a routine mission, nothing special. Just another day in the life of a colonial officer. But then, according to Jansen's account, all hell broke loose. They stumbled into what he described as a nest of monstrosities. Spiders, he said, bigger than any he'd ever seen or imagined. Not just one or two, but a whole colony of them. The way Jansen told it, these things were the size of large dogs, with legs as thick as a man's wrist and fangs that could puncture leather. Now, I wasn't there, and I can't vouch for Jansen's state of mind. But I've read his account, and let me tell you, it's chilling. He described how these creatures moved with unnatural speed, swarming over the undergrowth and up tree trunks. The patrol opened fire, their rifles cracking in the dense jungle air, but it seemed to do little good. The spiders just kept coming. Jansen's patrol suffered heavy losses that day. Those who survived spoke of men being dragged off into the undergrowth, their screams echoing through the jungle before being suddenly, horrifically silenced. Jansen himself barely made it out alive, and his report was met with skepticism and disbelief by his superiors. But he stuck to his story until the day he died. You might think Jansen's tale was an isolated incident, the product of jungle fever or too much time in the oppressive Congo heat. But it wasn't long before similar stories started cropping up elsewhere. Take Arthur Sims, an English missionary working in Uganda in the early 1890s. Sims wasn't a military man, wasn't trained for combat or high-stress situations. He was just a regular fellow trying to spread the word of God in what he saw as darkest Africa. Sims and his team of porters were making their way through the Ugandan wilderness when they encountered what he later described as emissaries of Satan himself. According to Sims' journal, which I've had the privilege of reading, they were crossing a small clearing when the attack came. Giant spiders, he wrote, erupted from the surrounding jungle. They moved with terrifying speed, their huge, hairy bodies glinting in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the canopy. The porters, understandably, panicked. Some tried to run, others froze in terror. Sims wrote of watching in horror as one of the creatures pounced on a fleeing porter, its massive fangs sinking into the poor man's back. The missionary's description of the porter's agonized screams still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. Sims managed to escape, along with a handful of his porters, but the experience left him deeply shaken. He wrote extensively about the incident in his journal, describing the spiders in vivid, nightmarish detail. Like Jansen before him, Sims faced ridicule and disbelief when he shared his story. Many dismissed it as the ravings of a man driven mad by the African sun. But those of us who've heard similar tales from other sources aren't so quick to judge. These early accounts from Jansen and Sims, they're just the tip of the iceberg. As I dug deeper, I found more and more stories, spanning decades and continents. Each one unique, yet all sharing common threads. Encounters with spiders of impossible size, often in remote, unexplored areas. It's enough to make you wonder what else might be out there, hiding in the dark corners of our world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. These early tales, as fantastic as they seem, were just the beginning. As the world marched into the 20th century, as wars erupted and humans pushed further into uncharted territories, the reports kept coming. And with each new account, the legend of the giant spiders grew, taking on a life of its own. But that's a story for another time. For now, let these first encounters sink in, because believe me, it only gets wilder from here. As the world plunged into the chaos of the Second World War, you might think tales of giant spiders would fade into the background. But you'd be wrong. If anything, the global conflict seemed to stir up more encounters, as soldiers pushed into remote corners of the world that hadn't seen outsiders in generations. My own grandfather was one of those soldiers. He never talked much about the war, like many of his generation. But there was one story he told, late one night after a few too many whiskeys, that stuck with me. He was stationed in Papua New Guinea in '43, part of the Allied push to drive back the Japanese. The jungle there was like nothing he'd ever seen. Thick, steamy, alive in a way that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. One night, he was on patrol with a small squad, pushing through the undergrowth. The air was thick with the buzz of insects and the calls of strange birds. That's when they saw it. At first, my grandfather thought it was some kind of jungle cat, but as it moved into a patch of moonlight, he realized what he was seeing. It was a spider, but not like any he'd ever seen before. This thing was massive, easily the size of a large dog, with an emerald green body that seemed to glow in the dark. The way my grandfather described it, this spider moved with an unnatural grace for something so large. It skittered across the forest floor, legs as thick as a man's fingers leaving impressions in the soft earth. For a moment, everyone just froze. Then someone let out a yell, and all hell broke loose. Rifles cracked in the night air, muzzle flashes lighting up the jungle. But the spider was fast, incredibly fast. It darted between the trees, always just ahead of the bullets. My grandfather swore they chased that thing for what felt like hours, crashing through the underbrush, hearts pounding. But in the end, it vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but a set of massive footprints and a group of shaken soldiers who knew they'd seen something that defied explanation. Now you might think this was just one man's story, the product of fear and fatigue in a hostile environment. But here's the thing. My grandfather wasn't the only one. As I dug deeper into these accounts, I kept coming across similar stories from the Pacific Theater. Take Jackson, an Australian soldier who was also stationed in Papua New Guinea during the war. Jackson's story is even more harrowing than my grandfather's. He and his unit were on a long-range patrol, pushing deep into territory that hadn't seen a white face since the war began. They'd been moving for days, the oppressive heat and constant threat of enemy contact wearing them down. That's when they stumbled upon a cave system, hidden beneath a tangle of vines and roots. Seeking shelter from the relentless sun, they decided to make camp in the mouth of one of the caves. But as night fell, strange noises began echoing from deep within the caverns. Chittering sounds, like nothing they'd ever heard before. Jackson volunteered to take first watch, positioning himself at the cave entrance, rifle at the ready. It was near midnight when he saw them. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as more emerged from the depths of the cave, he realized he wasn't imagining things. Spiders, dozens of them, each one the size of a large dog. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, reflecting the faint moonlight that filtered through the jungle canopy. Jackson's shout of alarm woke the rest of the unit, and chaos erupted. In the confined space of the cave mouth, their rifles were almost useless. Men fought with whatever they could grab: knives, entrenching tools, bare hands. Jackson described a nightmarish scene of soldiers grappling with monstrous arachnids, the air filled with the sound of gunfire, screams, and the sickening crunch of chitinous bodies. By the time dawn broke, Half the unit was dead or missing. Those who survived were left with wounds that defied explanation and a story that no one back at headquarters wanted to believe. Jackson and the others were quietly shipped back to Australia, their reports buried in the chaos of wartime bureaucracy. These stories, my grandfather's and Jackson's, they're just two of many that came out of the Pacific during World War II. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't isolated incidents, confined to one small area. Similar reports started cropping up all across the theater of war, from the jungles of Burma to the remote islands of the Philippines. It's like the conflict itself stirred something up, awakening ancient creatures that had lain dormant for centuries. Or maybe it was just that we were pushing into places humans hadn't gone before, stumbling across things that had always been there, hidden from view. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could something like this be kept secret? Surely, if giant spiders were real, we'd have concrete evidence by now. And you're not wrong to be skeptical. Hell, I've spent years collecting these stories, and there are times I still find myself doubting. The scientific community certainly does. They'll tell you it's impossible, that spiders simply can't grow to the sizes described in these accounts. But here's the thing. The world's a big place, and we're discovering new species all the time. Just look at the giant squid. For centuries, it was dismissed as a sailor's tale, the stuff of legend. Now we have video footage of these creatures in their natural habitat. Is it really so hard to believe that something similar could be true of these giant spiders? And let's not forget, many of these encounters happened in some of the most remote, least explored parts of the world. Places where the jungle canopy is so thick that satellite imaging is nearly useless, where local tribes tell stories of monsters in the forest that go back generations. I'm not saying I have all the answers. Far from it. But after hearing story after story, from men who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out, I can't help but wonder, what if there's something to all this? What if in the darkest corners of our world, there really are monsters lurking? It's a chilling thought, but one that I haven't been able to shake, no matter how hard I try. As the war drew to a close and soldiers returned home, many of these stories were forgotten or dismissed. But for those who lived through these encounters, the memories never faded. And as we'll see, the reports didn't stop with the end of World War II. If anything, they were just the beginning of a new chapter in this ongoing mystery. But that's a story for another time. As the world moved on from the Second World War, you might think the stories of giant spiders would fade into obscurity. But that wasn't the case. If anything, the reports became more frequent as new conflicts erupted in remote corners of the globe. The Vietnam War, in particular, seemed to stir up a hornet's nest of arachnid encounters. I remember sitting down with Mr. Maximus' father-in-law, a grizzled Vietnam vet who'd seen more than his fair share of combat. He was reluctant to talk at first, but once he started, it was like a dam breaking. He told me about multiple encounters with spiders that defied belief, creatures that haunted his dreams long after he'd left the jungle behind. One story stood out. It was during the rainy season, and his unit was on a routine patrol near the Laotian border. The jungle was thick, the air so humid it felt like you were breathing underwater. They'd stopped to rest near a small stream, the sound of running water a welcome break from the constant buzz of insects. That's when they saw it. At first, they thought it was some kind of crab, its legs creating ripples as it moved across the surface of the water. But as it emerged from the stream, they realized what they were looking at. It was a spider, but one unlike anything they'd ever seen. This thing was the size of a dinner plate, its body a mottled brown that blended perfectly with the muddy bank. Mr. Maximus' father-in-law described how the spider moved with an unnatural speed, skittering up the bank and disappearing into the underbrush before anyone could react. For a moment, everyone just stood there, trying to process what they'd seen. Then someone let out a nervous laugh, and the tension broke. But the incident left its mark. From that day on, the unit was on high alert every time they approached a water source. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. Over the course of his tour, Mr. Maximus' father-in-law claimed to have seen these oversized arachnids on multiple occasions, always near water, always moving with that same uncanny speed. He told me how the locals seemed to know about these creatures, warning American troops to stay away from certain areas, especially at night. Now, I know what you're thinking. Vietnam was a hell of a drug, and soldiers were under immense stress. It's easy to dismiss these stories as hallucinations or the product of combat fatigue. But here's the thing. The consistency of these accounts is striking. Time and again, soldiers from different units, operating in different parts of the country, reported similar encounters. I've got to admit, hearing these stories brought back memories of my own time in Southeast Asia. While I never saw anything quite as large as what Mr. Maximus' father-in-law described, I did have my fair share of run-ins with some unnaturally big creepy crawlies. I remember one night on patrol, the darkness so thick you could almost feel it pressing against your skin. We were moving through a section of jungle that felt different, quieter, somehow, like even the insects were holding their breath. That's when I saw it. Just a glimpse, really illuminated for a split second by a stray beam from my flashlight. A spider, easily the size of my hand, clinging to a nearby tree trunk. Its eyes reflected the light, 8 pinpricks of blue-green that seemed to stare right through me. I blinked, and it was gone, vanished into the shadows as if it had never been there. For a long time, I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and the oppressive darkness of the jungle. But after hearing similar stories from so many others, I'm not so sure anymore. There was something out there in those jungles, something that didn't fit neatly into our understanding of the natural world. These encounters, mine included, pale in comparison to some of the more extreme reports. But they serve as a kind of bridge, a connection between the fantastic tales of dog-sized spiders and the more mundane reality of jungle warfare. They'd make you wonder, if spiders the size of dinner plates are real, is it really such a stretch to imagine something even larger? The Vietnam War eventually came to an end, but the stories didn't stop. As the years went by, I kept hearing whispers, fragments of tales from veterans of other conflicts. Desert Storm, the Balkans, Afghanistan, wherever soldiers were deployed to remote or hostile environments, reports of oversized arachnids seemed to follow. But it wasn't until the Iraq War that things really took a turn. That's when I heard a story that made even my battle-hardened skin crawl. A story that, if true, suggests these giant spiders aren't just surviving in the world's remote jungles and mountains, but potentially thriving in environments where we least expect them. I met Bill, the soldier who told me this story, at a veterans support group. He was a young guy, barely into his 30s, but with the haunted eyes of someone who'd seen too much. At first, I thought he was there to talk about PTSD or the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. But as we got to talking, I realized he had a very different kind of trauma he was dealing with. Bill had been stationed at Brassfield-Mora, a forward operating base in northern Iraq, back in 2009. It was a small outpost, perched on the edge of the desert like some kind of modern-day frontier fort. The surrounding landscape was harsh, all dust and scrub brush, with mountains looming in the distance. One night, Bill was on perimeter watch. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the desert landscape. He told me how quiet it was, the kind of silence that seems to press in on your eardrums. That's when he saw something moving just beyond the base's protective barriers. At first, he thought it was a dog, maybe a stray that had wandered too close to the base. But as he watched, he realized this was no dog. The way it moved was all wrong. Too low to the ground, too fluid. And then it stepped into a pool of light cast by one of the perimeter floodlights, and Bill felt his heart stop. It was a spider, but not just any spider. This thing, according to Bill, was massive. He described it as being the size of a small car, its legs spanning at least 8 feet from tip to tip. Its body was a mottled brown and black, perfectly camouflaged for the desert environment. Bill stood there, frozen in shock, as the creature skittered along the edge of the base. He wanted to sound the alarm, to alert his fellow soldiers, but fear had robbed him of his voice. And then, as he watched, things went from bad to worse. A stray cat, one of the many that hung around the base scavenging for scraps, wandered into view. It never stood a chance. The spider moved with lightning speed, covering the distance in a heartbeat. Bill described hearing a sickening crunch as the arachnid's massive fangs pierced the cat's body. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the spider was gone, taking its prey with it. The whole incident, Bill swears, couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it was a minute that would change his life forever. When he finally found his voice and reported what he'd seen, he was met with disbelief and ridicule. His superiors suggested he'd been hallucinating from the stress and lack of sleep. Some of his fellow soldiers joked that he'd been out in the sun too long. But Bill knows what he saw. The image of that enormous spider, silhouetted against the desert night, is burned into his memory. He can still hear the sound of its legs scraping against the dusty ground, still see the glint of moonlight on its multifaceted eyes. As I listened to Bill's story, I couldn't help but think about all the other accounts I'd collected over the years. The Belgian officer in the Congo, the missionary in Uganda, the soldiers in World War II and Vietnam. Each story unique, yet all sharing common threads. Encounters with spiders of impossible size, often in remote or conflict-ridden areas. Bill's account was different, though. It wasn't set in some remote jungle or on a distant island. This happened at a modern military base in a region that's been inhabited for thousands of years. If these creatures could exist there, undetected, what did that mean for the rest of the world? As our conversation drew to a close, I could see the relief in Bill's eyes. Relief at finally being able to tell his story to someone who didn't immediately dismiss it as the ravings of a traumatized soldier. But I could also see the fear, the lingering terror of a man who had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. I left that meeting with Bill's story rattling around in my head, adding to the growing collection of impossible tales I'd gathered over the years. Each one a piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Because if these stories were true, if these giant spiders really did exist, what did that mean for us? What other impossible creatures might be lurking in the shadows, just beyond the edge of our perception? But that's a question for another time. For now, let's let Bill's story sink in, because believe me, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Bill's story about the giant spider at Brassfield-Mora haunted me for weeks after our conversation. I couldn't shake the image of that monstrous arachnid silhouetted against the Iraqi night sky. As a veteran myself, I knew the toll that combat could take on a person's psyche. But there was something about Bill's account that rang true, something that resonated with all the other stories I'd collected over the years. I decided to dig deeper. It wasn't easy. The military isn't exactly forthcoming with information about unexplained phenomena at their bases. But I've made some contacts over the years, people who owe me favors or share my curiosity about these impossible creatures. Slowly, piece by piece, I started to put together a clearer picture of what happened that night in 2009. Brassfield-Mora was a small forward operating base, little more than a collection of prefab buildings and defensive positions carved out of the Iraqi desert. It was the kind of place where the line between order and chaos was thin, where the vast emptiness of the surrounding landscape seemed to press in on you from all sides. The night of the incident started like any other. The sun had set hours ago, leaving behind a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the day's blistering heat. Most of the base's personnel were either asleep or going about their nightly routines. Bill was on perimeter watch, a lonely job that involved hours of staring into the darkness, jumping at every shadow and sound. He'd been at it for hours, his eyes straining to make out shapes in the gloom beyond the base's floodlights. That's when he saw it, a movement that didn't fit, something that set off every alarm bell in his combat-trained mind. At first he thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on him. The desert at night can do strange things to your perception, turning rocks into crouching enemies and scrub brush into lurking monsters. But as he watched, the shape resolved itself into something that defied explanation. It moved like liquid shadow, each leg falling with impossible precision. Bill described how it seemed to flow across the ground. Its massive body held mere inches above the sandy soil. As it entered the pool of light cast by one of the perimeter floods, he got his first clear look at the creature. It was, without a doubt, a spider. But not like any spider he'd ever seen before. This thing was enormous, its body alone the size of a small car. 8 legs, each as thick as a man's arm, propelled it forward with terrifying speed. Its entire body was covered in coarse, bristly hair that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. But it was the eyes that really got to Bill. 8 of them, clustered at the front of its head, gleaming with an intelligence that seemed almost human. He swore he could see his own reflection in those multifaceted orbs, could feel the weight of an alien intelligence assessing him. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Bill stood frozen at his post, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The spider paused at the edge of the light, as if it was aware of being observed. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it darted forward. That's when the cat appeared. It was one of the strays that hung around the base, drawn by the promise of scraps and the occasional kindness of homesick soldiers. The poor creature never stood a chance. One moment it was there, a small furry shape in the night. The next, it was gone, snatched up in the spider's massive mandibles. The sound is what stuck with Bill the most. Not the cat's cry, cut short as it was, but the sound of the spider's movement. A dry, rustling noise like dead leaves being crushed underfoot, mixed with the faint click of its legs against the hard-packed earth. It was a sound that would revisit him in his nightmares for years to come. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the spider was gone. It retreated into the darkness beyond the base perimeter, taking its unfortunate prey with it. The whole incident, from first sighting to disappearance, couldn't have lasted more than a minute or two. But for Bill, it was a lifetime. When he finally found his voice and reported what he'd seen, the reaction was predictable. His superior officers were skeptical, to say the least. They suggested stress, lack of sleep, maybe even hallucinogenic effects from exposure to unknown environmental factors. A few of the other soldiers joked that he'd been watching too many sci-fi movies. But here's the thing. Bill wasn't the only one who saw something that night. As I dug deeper, I uncovered other reports, quietly filed away and forgotten. A mechanic who swore he saw something big and wrong moving just beyond the motor pool. A communications officer who reported strange interference on the radio, accompanied by a skittering noise that made her skin crawl. None of these other witnesses saw the spider as clearly as Bill did. But their accounts add weight to his story, suggesting that something truly unusual happened at Brassfield-Mora that night. Of course, the official record makes no mention of giant arachnids or any other unexplained phenomena. The military has a long history of sweeping inconvenient truths under the rug, especially when those truths challenge our understanding of the natural world. But for those who were there, for those who saw or heard or sensed something beyond the ordinary, the memory lingers. As I pieced together the events of that night, I couldn't help but wonder about the bigger picture. If a creature like this could exist in the Iraqi desert, practically under the noses of hundreds of trained soldiers, what else might be out there? What other impossible beings might be lurking in the shadows of our world, just beyond the reach of our understanding? The implications are staggering. We like to think we've mapped every inch of our planet, that there are no more unknowns, no more monsters lurking in uncharted territories. But the truth is, there's still so much we don't know. The deep oceans, the dense jungles, the vast deserts, these places still hold secrets, still have the power to surprise and terrify us. And then there's the question of origin. Where did this creature come from? Was it some kind of holdover from prehistoric times, a relic of an age when insects grew to monstrous sizes? Or was it something else entirely? The result of some secret military experiment gone wrong, perhaps, or even a visitor from another world. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I'm the first to be skeptical of wild theories and conspiracy thinking. But after years of collecting these stories, after hearing account after account from credible witnesses, I can't help but feel we're on the edge of something big. Something that could change our understanding of the world and our place in it. As for Bill, he left the military soon after the incident at Brassfield-Mora. The official reason was listed as PTSD, and I'm sure that played a part. But I think it was more than that. I think he glimpsed something that night that shook his faith in the orderly, explainable world we all want to believe in. And once you've seen behind that curtain, there's no going back. I've often wondered what I would have done in Bill's place. Would I have had the courage to report what I'd seen, knowing the ridicule and disbelief I'd face? Or would I have kept quiet, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by stress and fatigue? In the end, I think that's why these stories resonate with me so much. They're not just tales of impossible creatures. They're stories of human beings confronted with something that challenges everything they thought they knew about the world. They're stories of courage in the face of the unknown, of individuals willing to stand by the truth of their experiences, even when no one else believes them. As I sit here, surrounded by files and notebooks filled with accounts of giant spiders and other inexplicable phenomena, I can't help but feel we're on the brink of something. A discovery, perhaps, that will force us to reevaluate our place in the natural world. Or maybe just a growing awareness that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we ever imagined. Whatever the case, I know I'll keep collecting these stories. Because somewhere in the tangle of fact and fiction, of half-remembered encounters and vivid nightmares, there's a truth waiting to be uncovered. A truth about the world we live in and the creatures we share it with. And who knows, maybe someday I'll have a story of my own to add to the collection. But until then, I'll keep listening, keep questioning, and keep wondering about the giants that might be lurking just beyond the edge of our perception.